AITA for giving my ring back after my fiancé made a comment to his guy friends regarding why we haven't gotten married. When we got engaged 4 years ago, it felt like the most natural step in our lives together. After dating for almost 4 years, the thought of spending my life with him was as sure as sunrise. There was no extravagant proposal, no grand gestures. It was quiet, heartfelt, and perfect for us. In those early days, I imagined all the moments we'd share, building a life, getting married, creating a home. Our relationship had weathered its fair share of ups and downs. But we were solid. I felt like we were one of those lucky couples who had found something rare. Back then, we had our lives planned out. Or at least it felt that way. We thought we'd be married by the following year. Maybe even looking at our first home. But then life happened, as it often does, with all its sharp turns and surprises. Not long after our engagement, the world turned upside down with COVID. Our plans screeched to a halt. Weddings were cancelled, families separated, and everything became uncertain. But even through the pandemic, I still held onto the hope of a future where we'd eventually have our day. After COVID, it seemed like one setback after another. Losing our housing situation left us practically homeless. We were couch surfing, moving around from one temporary place to another. It was exhausting, disheartening even, but somehow, it felt okay because I knew we were facing it together. He was my partner, and together, we could handle anything life threw at us. When I became pregnant, the world shifted again. All our energy went into planning for our baby, building up some stability, and focusing on getting our lives back on track. Through it all, I clung to the thought of our wedding. That one beautiful day where we'd finally make our commitment official. But as our child grew, our financial burdens also grew. Money was tight, and the wedding slipped further into the background. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to timing. Assuming we'd get there eventually. I just kept holding on, hoping that once things calmed down and we were back on our feet, we'd finally make it happen. And for a while, I accepted that. It wasn't like he'd said no to marriage, he'd said, not yet. In the meantime, I reminded myself how grateful I was for our relationship, for him, and for our family. I'd wait because I loved him, and I believed in the life we were building together. As life settled back into some form of normalcy, the hope of our wedding resurfaced, stronger and more vivid than ever. It was no longer about the grand celebration we had once considered but about simply sharing that moment. I didn't need an elaborate venue, an expensive dress, or a massive guest list. What I wanted was straightforward, a day to celebrate us, with our closest family and friends. I'd started envisioning a backyard wedding, something intimate and low-key, where the focus could be on our commitment rather than costly decorations or elaborate setups. I brought up the idea to him one night, saying we could do a potluck, ask family and friends to pitch in with food, maybe even set up some string lights, and just keep it simple. I didn't need the glitz, I only wanted to look into his eyes and say, I do, surrounded by the people who mattered most to us. When he agreed, I felt a spark of hope reignite. It wasn't an enthusiastic, yes, let's plan right away, but it was enough for me. He mentioned that maybe we could try for the summer of 2025. Which felt like a reasonable timeframe. I knew we still had some things to work through financially. But finally, we had a goal, a timeline that would bring my dream of marriage within reach. The planning didn't take off from there, though. Life, as usual, continued to take priority, and the idea of the wedding was again swept under the rug. But I held on to that promise of July-ish 2025, and the idea of standing with him under the summer sky. Finally, husband and wife. I remember the evening so vividly, one of those easygoing nights with friends and neighbors. My fiancé and I were at our neighbor's house, unwinding. I was with the wives in the kitchen, talking and laughing about anything and everything. And he was outside with the guys, bonding over beer and cars. It was one of those times that reminded me why I loved him. Why our relationship worked. The camaraderie, the ease, it was all perfect. At least, until I overheard a conversation that would plant a seed of doubt I couldn't shake. Through the open window, I heard one of his friends joking. Once you get married, everything stops. The words didn't sting at first. just one of those age-old jabs at marriage that people toss around without much thought. But then my fiancé chimed in, his voice ringing out with a laugh that sounded sharper than I was prepared for. "That's why I've been dragging my feet on marriage," he said, laughing along with the others. In that moment, I froze, feeling each word hit like a blow. I tried to tell myself it was just harmless talk. The kind of locker room banter that people fall into, especially around friends. But it didn't feel harmless. The comment lingered, sinking into my thoughts and unsettling everything I had been so certain of. I played it off that night, keeping my feelings to myself, trying to let it roll off my shoulders. I didn't want to turn a casual comment into something bigger, but I couldn't deny the change within me. This new, quiet hurt simmering just below the surface. It wasn't just that he had made a joke at my expense, it was what it revealed about how he might really feel about us. About marriage, and about committing to a future together. The ring on my finger felt a little heavier after that night. And so did the weight of our, July-ish 2025, plan. I tried to shake it off. But that comment haunted me for days, making me question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. I wanted to believe that he was just caught up in the moment, trying to fit in with the guys. But a voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. I needed to hear from him, to see if that laugh and those words reflected his true feelings or if they were just part of some guy talk that I wasn't meant to hear. One evening, I decided to bring up the wedding plans again. I thought it might give him a chance to clarify or reassure me that he still wanted this. That he still wanted me. I asked simple questions, things like what colors he envisioned for the wedding and if he had any ideas for a small, meaningful celebration. I kept it light, hoping to ease into the topic. But his reaction was immediate and cold. He didn't even hesitate before shutting me down, suggesting we weigh the pros and cons of being married first. My heart sank. This wasn't just about money or the perfect wedding day. He was questioning the entire concept of us getting married. In that moment, his uncertainty was laid bare, and it felt like he'd tugged a thread that unraveled everything we'd spent years building. I didn't say much. I simply walked outside, my mind buzzing with a mix of disbelief and heartache. I looked down at the ring on my finger, a symbol that had once brought me so much joy and hope. But now it felt hollow, as though it represented a commitment that only I truly wanted. When I went back inside, I held the ring in my hand, the small, shimmering circle feeling strangely heavy. Without a word, I walked over and gently placed it on the table in front of him. Then I turned, moved to the kitchen, and asked him what he wanted for dinner. My voice as calm as I could muster. I didn't want to make a scene or spiral into a fight. I just wanted to be clear, to take the air out of this building tension and communicate what was unspoken but obvious between us. He looked at me, stunned. I could see the confusion in his face, the tension in his body as he asked, "What are you doing? Why are you giving this back?" His tone had a hint of anger, maybe even betrayal. It was ironic. Really, I'd felt those same things swirling inside me for weeks. But I'd held it all in. I didn't want to accuse him or try to force him into a conversation he wasn't ready to have. Still, I couldn't just ignore the hurt his words had caused. The nagging feeling that he was standing with one foot out the door of our future. Without raising my voice, I told him exactly why. I mentioned his comment about dragging his feet to his friends. Then his vague statement about needing to weigh the pros and cons of marrying me. I tried to keep it simple and honest. I said, "If you're unsure, then I can't keep waiting. Wondering if we're moving forward or stuck in some holding pattern. I love you, but I don't want to keep wearing a ring that symbolizes a future you might not even want." He shot back almost immediately. Defensive, he told me I was overreacting. That he wasn't saying it wouldn't happen, just that we had to be practical. He seemed caught off guard, almost offended, as if I'd blindsided him with a reality he hadn't considered. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence. A quiet punctuated only by the faint clink of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, and our hushed footsteps as we tiptoed around each other. The ring still sat on the table, untouched and glaring, a reminder of everything I had tried to communicate yet left unresolved. I kept waiting for him to bring it up again, to break the ice and start a real conversation. But he seemed almost paralyzed by my decision, unwilling or unable to meet me halfway. I tried to go about my usual routines, but everything felt like I was wading through water. Mornings were the worst, waking up and feeling that void on my finger. A constant, subtle ache I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the ring or the symbol it represented, it was the life we'd been building. The life I thought we both wanted. It was the years we had invested, the moments we'd shared, and the plans we'd sketched out together. Now, those plans felt like they'd been drafted on sand, washed away with a single wave of doubt. I spent more time with our friends, sometimes bringing up the conversation in fragments, hoping for some sense of validation or advice. A few of my close friends told me they could see both sides, which wasn't what I wanted to hear. I didn't want to be rational about it. I wanted to know if my gut reaction was justified, if my response to his hesitation was right. One friend, Sarah, a fiercely independent woman who'd never really understood the whole marriage thing, shrugged and said, "Honestly, if he's unsure, he's not worth the wait." She had a point. Then there was Anna, who had been married for nearly a decade. She offered a more sobering perspective. Maybe he just needs time. You know, men are wired differently. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you. But love wasn't the question, commitment was. And the more time I spent thinking about it, the clearer that distinction became. I could feel his love, had always felt it. It wasn't that I doubted he cared. It was that his hesitation on marriage hinted at something deeper. A reluctance to bind himself fully to the life we'd discussed. The future I thought we both wanted. In quiet moments, I started wondering if maybe I had misinterpreted the strength of our connection. Had I convinced myself that his love was enough to carry us through the uncertainties? Had I ignored signs, overlooked his subtle hesitations, and buried my own discomfort whenever he avoided talking about marriage? Despite everything, part of me clung to hope. I kept expecting that he'd wake up one morning, realize what I meant to him, and come to me ready to commit. But he didn't. Instead, the days continued to pass, each one leaving the gap between us wider and harder to bridge. One evening, as I prepared dinner alone, I found myself staring at the place where he usually sat, that empty seat at the table. The weight of our unresolved tension settled on me like a stone, pressing down until I could barely breathe. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life without him, a life where I didn't have to wonder if he would ever truly be all in. And as difficult as it was to acknowledge, there was a small sense of relief in that thought, a hint of freedom in letting go of a future that no longer felt solid. The day I decided to step back, truly step back, was unlike anything I'd anticipated. There wasn't a dramatic moment, no tearful confrontation, no sudden epiphany. It was just quiet. I had been folding laundry, sorting his shirts from mine, and something in the silence gave me the clarity I'd been searching for. It felt strange, how clear and simple everything seemed when I thought about it from a place of letting go. All the years we'd spent together, all the memories and laughter, were like a comforting cushion for my heart. I wasn't mad at him. Not really. I just didn't want to keep waiting for someone to give me a level of commitment that I'd already given. And I realized then that maybe this wasn't something he was even capable of giving. At least not right now. I didn't want to spend years hoping he'd change or that one day he'd wake up and feel the same urgency I did about our future together. I sat with that thought for a long time, letting it settle like dust around me. It was both terrifying and oddly liberating to face the possibility of moving forward on my own terms, without the expectations and the waiting. For so long, my life had been entwined with his dreams, his aspirations, and our shared journey. I realized I hadn't really paused to ask myself what I wanted outside of him. Outside of us. That night, I went to bed early, wrapping myself in the comfort of my own decisions. I lay awake, thinking of all the things I'd wanted to experience, some with him. Yes, but others, I could admit now, were just for me. I wanted the confidence to make choices without second-guessing if they would fit into his vision for his life. I wanted to see how it felt to prioritize my happiness, to follow my instincts and not have them dulled by someone else's uncertainty. Over the next few days, I quietly started making changes. I signed up for a yoga class I'd always wanted to try. One that he'd laughed off as a little too new age. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from over the years. People I'd missed without realizing it. I even began looking into classes for a certification that could open doors in my career. It felt good to focus on things that made me happy. Things that didn't require validation from anyone but me. When he noticed the subtle shifts, he was taken aback. I could see the confusion in his eyes. But I didn't want to explain. How could I explain something I was just beginning to understand myself? The look he gave me was one of longing and sadness. But for once, I didn't rush to comfort him. I realized that I couldn't keep tending to his feelings at the expense of my own. One evening, as I was heading out to meet a friend, he asked me, almost hesitantly, if we could talk. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm when I said, "Not tonight." It wasn't out of anger or spite, it was a simple boundary. One that I hadn't given myself a space to establish before. As I walked out the door, there was a lightness in my step. It wasn't that I didn't care about him anymore, it was that I finally cared about myself. 2 months have passed since that quiet moment when I decided to let go of the wedding I'd once envisioned and, in some ways, let go of the person I'd been trying to be for him. The simplicity of it still amazes me. No grand gestures. No dramatic ending. Just the gradual unfolding of a life I hadn't realized I was missing. The first days were strange. Like adjusting to a new rhythm. There were moments of emptiness. Not just from his absence but from the space left behind by the S I had built in my mind. But little by little, I learned to fill that space with myself. I began exploring interests I'd brushed aside. Hobbies I'd let gather dust in favor of things he preferred. Paths I'd left unexplored. One of those paths led me back to the certification class I'd been interested in for years. It's amazing how refreshing it felt to learn something purely for me. I had forgotten how inspiring it could be to expand my horizons. To challenge myself in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or timeline. I moved into a new apartment in a vibrant neighborhood. One that felt like it had energy and life in it. With space for my books. My plants. My music. The very act of setting up my own space felt like a declaration. A testament to my commitment to myself. The days became filled with tiny joys, learning to cook new recipes. The satisfaction of making my own choices. The freedom of setting boundaries without feeling guilty. And I adopted a dog. Not just any dog but one who, like me, had a gentle resilience, a calm loyalty. Her name is Luna, and together we explore this new chapter. Walking her each morning has become a ritual of clarity, a reminder that life, with all its twists and turns, is best lived authentically and fearlessly. Sometimes, I still hear from my ex-fiancé. He's reached out a few times, trying to rekindle things, apologizing, saying he's ready now. I listen, but I realize that the woman he remembers isn't the woman I am now. I'm grateful for what we shared, but I don't feel a longing to return to it. I think he senses that, too. This journey has shown me the resilience within myself, the courage I never knew I had. The self-worth I'd overlooked for too long. I've learned to trust my instincts, to celebrate my own strength, and to cherish the beauty of building a life that's entirely my own. And as I look toward the future, I feel a deep sense of peace and possibility that I know will guide me wherever I choose to go. My husband is having a baby with his affair partner. I want him to choose between me and the baby. I think it's fair to say I didn't see it coming. That's not to say we hadn't had our rough patches. After 15 years together, who hasn't? But I always saw us as that one couple who could weather any storm. Who somehow always found our way back to each other. Maybe it was naivety or maybe just blind trust. But I thought we'd built something strong. A fortress of trust and understanding that nothing could penetrate. Then, 2 months ago, the fortress fell. It was an ordinary Tuesday night when he told me. I'd just finished loading the dishwasher when he sat me down at the kitchen table. His face was pale, hands trembling in a way I'd only ever seen once, when he'd held his mother's hand on her deathbed. He'd been so lost that day. And now, sitting across from him, I felt that same helplessness. That same terrifying unknown lingering in the air. He admitted he'd been having an affair. He didn't start with an apology. Just the admission. A year-long affair with a woman he met through a mutual friend. The words came out as if they'd been rehearsed. And I wondered if he'd gone over this conversation 100 times in his head. Preparing for the worst but hoping for some form of understanding. He wouldn't get that. Not from me. The initial shock was followed by silence. A silence so dense it felt like the house was holding its breath with me, waiting to see if I'd break. I didn't. I didn't scream or demand answers. I sat, frozen, unable to process this betrayal from the man I'd built my life with. It was like he had handed me a new reality, a life where trust was shattered. Where I was no longer his one and only but part of some shameful secret he'd managed to hide for a year. He talked for a while, saying how sorry he was, how ashamed he felt, how much he regretted the pain he'd caused me. He begged for my forgiveness, tears streaking down his face as he confessed his shame and remorse. A part of me wanted to reach out and comfort him, but then the reality of what he'd done would hit me again. And my hand would pull back, too disgusted to offer any solace. It took a week before I could say anything of substance to him. A week spent in agonizing silence, replaying every moment of our relationship, wondering when and where it had all gone wrong. And he stayed, pleading with me to consider rebuilding, promising to do anything to make things right. It was clear he was desperate, that he knew he'd ruined something precious. But desperation didn't erase the betrayal, and no amount of pleading could undo what he'd done. Finally, I agreed. I would give him one chance. One more opportunity to prove he could be the man I thought I'd married. I told myself it was for the years we'd spent together, for the life we'd built. Maybe a part of me still wanted to believe in the person he used to be. The man who made me feel safe and cherished, who swore to love me for better or worse. So, we started again, picking up the shattered pieces, attempting to glue them back together. He blocked her on every platform, deleted her number, and promised me that she was out of his life for good. And despite my skepticism, I chose to believe him. It was fragile, this new beginning. Each day was a battle between wanting to trust him and fearing he'd break me again. I clung to the hope that we could find our way back to each other, that somehow this rupture could be healed. I knew it would be a long journey, but I was willing to try, because in my heart, I still loved him, and I wanted to believe that love was enough to bring us through this nightmare. Just as I was starting to breathe again, life threw another sucker punch. A week ago, my husband walked into the living room, holding his phone like it was a grenade about to explode. He was white as a sheet, his fingers tight around the edges of the phone, knuckles showing white. I thought maybe he'd received some bad news from work, or something terrible had happened to one of his friends or family members. But when he handed me the phone, I saw the email notification on the screen, her name staring back at me like a ghost I thought I'd already buried. His affair partner was pregnant. My mind went blank. The words in front of me blurred, blending into an unreadable mess as my head spun. I felt like I was underwater, drowning, unable to catch my breath. Pregnant, after everything we'd been through, after all his promises to move forward and rebuild. She had somehow crawled back into our lives with a single, devastating email. He explained that she'd created a new email account to bypass the blocks he'd put on her original one. She had also attached pictures, proof of her claim that was impossible to deny. There it was, staring at me, a photo of her ultrasound, her blood test results, unmistakable and cruelly undeniable. I couldn't speak. It was as if the betrayal was happening all over again, magnified this time by the enormity of the consequences. The idea that another woman was carrying his child shattered something deep within me. In that moment, I felt every ounce of my resentment and pain come flooding back. Waves crashing against the fragile walls of forgiveness I'd been trying to build. I couldn't look at him. I just told him to leave, ordered him out of our house. Our shared life, the hurt, betrayal, and anger mixed into something unrecognizable. Something too powerful to contain. He left, and as soon as I was alone, I crumbled. This was a hurt that went beyond words. I was drowning in the unfairness of it all. The injustice of him having a future with a child when we'd fought so hard to have one together. Only to face disappointment after disappointment. I spent the next few days in a daze. Barely eating, barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sonogram, a sick reminder of the life he'd created with someone else. I thought about all the years we'd tried. The procedures, the emotional highs and lows, the painful hope that always ended in despair. And now he'd created a child outside our marriage. With someone else, a constant, living reminder of his betrayal. The gravity of what she was asking struck me. She'd made it clear she wouldn't go through with the pregnancy unless he wanted to be involved. It wasn't just about him being a father. It was about him choosing to bring this child into existence. And when I asked him what he planned to do, he told me, in a voice that broke my heart all over again, that he didn't want her to end the pregnancy. It might be his only chance to be a father. He said, as if those words didn't break me all over again. In that moment, I felt a new layer of betrayal settle over me. He was willing to sacrifice everything we'd worked to rebuild. To risk everything, just to have a child. It wasn't just that he wanted to be a father, it was that he was willing to put that dream above the future we'd tried so hard to salvage. I knew right then that I could never accept a life that included her. That child, or the mess he'd created. I didn't want to co-parent his affair partner's child or face the constant reminder of his mistake every single day. This was the line I couldn't cross. The one demand I couldn't compromise on. It was me or this future he was willing to create with her. But not both. I could feel the decision solidify inside me. Like a quiet strength awakening. I wouldn't beg him to choose. But if he wanted a life with me, he'd have to make the choice. After a few days, he came back. I knew he would. His things were still here. And despite everything, there was a part of him that couldn't fully let go. It was early morning when he walked in. I was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in the stillness of the dawn. The first cup of coffee barely cooling between my hands. His footsteps were heavy, hesitant. He moved cautiously, like he was testing the waters of a place he once called home but now felt foreign. He sat down across from me, not meeting my eyes. His gaze lingered on his hands, fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that seemed to mimic his nerves. I could see the weariness etched into his face, the fatigue and uncertainty that only worsened with each passing day. But I felt no sympathy. His was a hurt of his own making, a consequence he had brought upon himself, while mine was a scar he'd etched onto my heart, one I never asked for. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. I knew this conversation would define everything that came next. The make-or-break moment where I would discover if he valued the life we'd shared or if he was willing to gamble it all for a future that now felt entirely out of reach for me. I asked him simply, "What do you want?" I braced myself, waiting for the words that would tell me everything I needed to know. He finally spoke, hesitating before each word. He told me he was torn, that he didn't want to lose me. But he also couldn't ignore the idea of being a father. I never imagined it would be like this, he said, voice cracking slightly. I could feel the weight of his regret, the sorrow in his voice. But it did little to soften my own feelings. Regret wasn't enough to rebuild what he'd torn apart. I looked at him, feeling the weight of his indecision pressing against my own resolve. It was a heavy realization that, for him, this situation had become a tug of war between two futures, one with me, and one with the child he had created with her. But for me, there was no room for compromise. The idea of sharing my life with a reminder of his betrayal was unbearable. I couldn't face a future that included his affair partner, nor could I willingly step into a role that would tie me to her, the child, and to a reality born from his worst mistake. I told him I understood his desire to be a father, that I even felt the ache of that same dream we once shared. But that ache didn't lessen the reality of the betrayal, nor did it make the pain any easier to bear. I couldn't pretend that choosing to be involved with this child wouldn't cut me open all over again. I couldn't pretend that it wouldn't break me, piece by piece, every single day. I can't do this, not with her involved, not with the child between us. I told him firmly, you have to decide what matters most to you. He looked devastated, and for a brief moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd promised me a lifetime. A future filled with dreams we would build together. But that future felt impossibly far away now, overshadowed by the choices he'd made. After a long pause, he spoke softly, admitting he hadn't been ready to make the choice. He hoped I'd reconsider. That I'd be willing to find some way to accept this child as part of our lives. But I shook my head, knowing deep in my heart that this was where I drew the line. There was no reality in which I would willingly invite this pain into my life. No world where I could coexist peacefully with the woman who had shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. When he realized I wouldn't budge, he asked me what would happen if he chose the child. The question was like a knife in my heart. But I kept my voice steady as I told him that if he made that choice, I would leave. I'd end the marriage and cut ties. Because the life I wanted and the life he was willing to accept no longer aligned. That day, I saw the fear in his eyes. I think he finally understood the depth of what he stood to lose. But I knew I had to stand firm. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about my own survival. My own heart. I would not sacrifice myself to save a marriage that he had already thrown away once. I knew the choice I was asking him to make was painful. I knew it would tear him apart in its own way. But I also knew that I couldn't be the woman who silently swallowed her pride, her heartbreak, and her dignity for the sake of someone else's mistake. He had put us both in an impossible position. But he was the only one with the power to decide how it would end. He left again that day. Still undecided. But I had made my peace. Days went by in silence. My husband would drift in and out of the house like a ghost, staying only long enough to handle logistics and engage in strained, empty exchanges that felt rehearsed. In those moments, I wondered if he knew what he wanted or if he was just hoping I would change my mind. Bent to his need to hold on to everything at once. But I couldn't, and he knew it. Each time he stepped back into the house, I would catch his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the smallest things as if memorizing details, unsure whether this would still be his home tomorrow. It was a strange, suspended kind of existence, knowing that everything we had built together might fall apart with one decision. But instead of clarity, his visits brought more ambiguity, leaving me alone to replay our broken dreams on a loop. One night, just as I had finally fallen into a restless sleep, I felt the bed shift. He'd come home late, almost midnight, and sat on the edge of the bed without a word. There was something in his posture, a kind of defeated slouch, that told me he had finally come to a conclusion. A chill spread through me, my heart racing as I waited for him to speak. His words came out flat, hollow, as if they held too much weight for him to carry alone. He admitted he couldn't give up on the chance to be a father. That, despite everything, the thought of having a child, a part of him, a family of his own bloodline, was a calling he couldn't ignore. I felt my heart breaking all over again. Every fragile fragment I'd spent days piecing together disintegrating under the weight of his decision. It was a surreal moment. To sit there and absorb what I had known all along would be the outcome. I'd spent weeks preparing myself for this possibility, convincing myself I would be strong enough to face it. But hearing it out loud was an entirely different pain. A raw ache that left me feeling gutted. And just like that, a heavy silence filled the room, mingling with the darkness. Neither of us moved, our breaths barely rising above whispers as we faced the reality of what we were about to lose. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with regret, and murmured that he wished things could be different. But there was no changing this course. No way to undo the decision he had made the day he chose to betray me. For a brief moment, I wanted to scream, to claw at the hurt he had so easily brushed aside to justify his choice. But I knew better than to give him the satisfaction of my anger. This was not a moment for rage, it was a moment for clarity. For understanding what lay ahead and accepting that he had chosen a life that would forever be at odds with mine. I told him, voice steady but heart shattered, that I would be leaving. There would be no turning back. No renegotiating the terms. If he wanted this child, he would need to do it without me by his side. He nodded, a slow, resigned motion that told me he understood the finality of my words. We were no longer two people fighting for a marriage, we were strangers. Held together only by a shared past that had long since been fractured. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts spiraled into the unknown. The future loomed before me like an endless stretch of uncharted territory, filled with pain but also, perhaps, a sliver of hope, a life beyond this betrayal. One where I could rebuild from the ashes of everything I'd lost. By morning, he was gone, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that felt more like a formality than anything genuine. It was the final punctuation on the end of a chapter I had once thought would last a lifetime. He didn't ask me to stay. Didn't try to argue or offer some last-minute compromise. And that, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. As I packed my things over the next few days, I found myself flooded with memories that stung. Little moments that once meant everything but now felt hollow. The weight of each one bore down on me. But I let them go. Piece by piece, knowing they no longer had a place in the life I was about to create for myself. The home we had built was now nothing more than a shell. An echo of a dream that had vanished with his choice. Leaving wasn't easy. It never is. But as I walked out of that house, I felt a strange sense of peace. A clarity that had been missing since the day he confessed. I realized that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One where I could reclaim my happiness on my terms. And as I closed the door for the last time, I left behind the pieces of a life that no longer fit. Ready to face whatever came next. Walking out of our home felt surreal. Like leaving behind a piece of myself. For the first few weeks, the absence of my husband's presence, the quiet void of a once bustling household, gnawed at me. Every morning, I'd wake up alone, reaching instinctively for someone who wasn't there. But with each day, the ache lessened, replaced by a sense of resolve I hadn't expected. My first few weeks alone were all about navigating a strange new rhythm. Small tasks, things I used to do without a thought, now felt monumental. I'd get groceries and pause mid-aisle, suddenly unsure of what I even wanted to eat without another person's preferences to consider. But each small decision, each step I took toward creating a life of my own, felt empowering, even if tinged with loneliness. I dove headfirst into work, allowing the demands of my job to anchor me. It became a strange solace, a place where I felt valued and appreciated, unlike the hollow way I'd felt at home. Projects piled up, deadlines loomed, and I welcomed every task with open arms. I needed the distraction, something to pull me out of my thoughts and keep me moving forward. Coworkers, sensing my renewed focus, began inviting me to coffee or after-work drinks. Small gestures that reminded me I wasn't as alone as I felt. Surprisingly, the idea of reconnecting with old friends resurfaced. In the years I'd been married, I'd drifted from some close friends, letting life and the demands of a marriage subtly shift my priorities. Now, I reached out, sending tentative texts, making plans I once would have been too tired or uninterested to pursue. These meetups became a lifeline, catching up, laughing, and sharing pieces of my story with people who knew me well felt like retrieving fragments of myself I'd forgotten existed. My family, always a constant presence, rallied around me too. My sister, who'd seen the cracks forming even before I did, welcomed me into her home more times than I could count, insisting I join for movie nights or impromptu weekend hikes. She let me vent when I needed to, encouraged me to laugh when I didn't think I could, and reminded me of the strength I'd somehow forgotten I possessed. It was in those quiet moments, with her or friends who loved me, that I realized I was building a new foundation, one rooted in genuine support and understanding. Still, the memories lingered. There were nights when sleep eluded me, when I'd replay every word he'd said, every promise we'd broken. It was during one of these nights, as I sat on my living room floor surrounded by half-packed boxes and unfinished photo albums, that I felt a rush of clarity. It was time to let go, not just of him, but of the expectations I'd set for myself, of the picture-perfect life I'd clung to so tightly. One quiet afternoon, I began sorting through my belongings, starting with the most painful reminders of what I'd lost. Wedding photos, mementos from our trips, the engagement ring he'd picked out so many years ago, all of it. I carefully wrapped each item and tucked it away in a box marked Memories, knowing I wasn't ready to part with them entirely, but that I also no longer wanted them in my day-to-day life. Oddly, the process felt liberating. I rearranged my living room, swapped out a few old pictures for new ones of my niece and nephews, and even splurged on a new rug I'd admired for months but never bought. Thinking it wasn't practical, it was a small change, maybe even trivial, but it felt like reclaiming my space. In the following weeks, I began journaling, something I dabbled in sporadically but never committed to. I poured out every thought, every feeling I couldn't voice aloud, letting the words flow without filter. This became my therapy, a private space where I could process the hurt, the anger, and even the lingering love I still felt. Over time, those entries evolved from anger and grief to hope and self-discovery. I was piecing myself back together, rediscovering who I was outside of the roles I'd played for so long. My heartache didn't vanish. There were days when it still hurt as much as it had in those early moments. But alongside the pain was something new, an inkling of excitement. A tentative anticipation for what lay ahead. I was learning to embrace the unknown, to see it not as something to fear but as a canvas waiting for me to paint my own story. Slowly but surely, I could feel myself growing, reshaping, and becoming someone stronger, wiser, and braver than I had been before. The journey wasn't easy, and the scars were still fresh. But for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, deeply alive. One of the hardest parts of moving forward was confronting the new reality with my husband. I'd forgiven him once, but the news of the affair child had shifted something in me that forgiveness couldn't fix. This wasn't a matter of mere infidelity, it was the introduction of another life that would permanently tether him to his affair partner, linking us forever to a betrayal that cut deeply. The reconciliation we had been working on suddenly felt flimsy, like a fragile truce that couldn't withstand this new, devastating revelation. Once he moved back home, he made an attempt to reconnect, but I was careful to establish boundaries. We communicated only about logistics, the sale of our shared belongings, his move-out arrangements, and necessary conversations about the house. The walls I built between us were not meant to be cruel, they were an act of self-preservation. My own way of holding on to what was left of my emotional health and sense of stability. He reached out several times, asking to talk, as though he was seeking some kind of closure for himself. In one last attempt, he texted, "I never wanted it to end like this. Can we meet to talk?" His words felt hollow, another reminder of the weight of his choices. I knew that meeting in person would drag me back into an emotional spiral I could barely contain. My response was short, yet firm. "We've said everything that needed to be said. I need space now." The ensuing silence, as much as it hurt, was a relief. For once, the constant questioning, the emotional roller coaster of whether I'd be enough for him, had quieted. I had done my part. But now, it was time to move forward without him. And if there was one thing I'd learned from this ordeal, it was that I deserved to reclaim my peace. Then came his family. His mother reached out to me, clearly confused, expressing her wish that we would somehow work it out. "You've been a part of our lives for so long. And he's just made a terrible mistake," she pleaded. But she didn't see it through my eyes. She saw her son as a good man who had stumbled, not as the man who'd shattered the life we'd built. I explained, calmly but firmly, that while I had respect for her family, I needed distance to heal. The choice was mine, and I wouldn't let the weight of anyone else's expectations sway me from what I knew was best for myself. Friends, too, voiced their own opinions. Most of my close friends supported me unconditionally, but others played devil's advocate, wondering aloud if I'd regret giving up after 15 years. The weight of that word, giving up, triggered something in me. They weren't the ones left picking up the pieces or dealing with the fallout of broken promises. They hadn't experienced the betrayal firsthand. The choice to walk away wasn't giving up, it was letting go of a dream that no longer served me. A dream that had been dismantled by the very person who should have cherished it most. There were days when I'd catch myself second-guessing everything. Had I been too rigid? Was there a way to make peace with the life he'd brought into our world? But every time I spiraled into self-doubt, I remembered how I felt in those first days, reeling, nauseated, heartbroken. The boundaries I'd put up were not just a shield but a promise to myself that I would never let anyone take me to that place again. Reclaiming my sense of self meant redefining my identity beyond my role as a wife. I started thinking of my future without the title I'd held for so long and began to see myself in ways I hadn't before. I realized I had always been more than half of a marriage. I was an individual with dreams and ambitions outside of that bond. And for the first time in a long time, I began allowing myself to envision a life that I would create on my terms. In a strange way, setting boundaries became the catalyst for rediscovering who I was. I had spent years blending my life with someone else's. But now, in reclaiming my time, my emotional energy, and my decisions, I felt empowered. I learned that boundaries weren't just barriers, they were the way back to myself. To the person I wanted to be. The person I could rely on unconditionally. Gradually, I started finding joy in the small things. Sunday mornings, once reserved for our shared routines, became my personal sanctuary. I'd brew a strong pot of coffee, curl up with a book, and let the quiet settle around me. I rediscovered my love for painting, a hobby I'd abandoned over the years, and let the strokes of color reflect the complexity of what I felt inside. There was beauty in solitude, a deep satisfaction in knowing that I could create a life, a rhythm, entirely my own. Establishing and maintaining these boundaries became a necessary act of self-love. They allowed me to see that life after loss wasn't merely about surviving. It was about thriving in a way I hadn't allowed myself to dream of before. Once the boundaries were set and the initial shock had subsided, I was left with the pressing question of what came next. The life I'd meticulously built was suddenly a ghost, lingering in places I used to find comfort. Friends, family, and even distant acquaintances had their opinions, but none of them were facing the reality I was living. None of them were standing in the rubble of a future I'd once been so sure of. Rediscovering what my future looked like without him meant embracing a completely new vision of who I was and where I wanted to go. I had to let go of the safety net I'd relied on for 15 years. A tether that had both grounded and confined me. For too long, I'd let my aspirations fit neatly within the scope of our shared dreams, never fully questioning what I wanted for myself outside of that narrative. So, I made the conscious decision to start small, to search for what still felt meaningful without needing anyone else's validation. One of the first steps was reclaiming my physical space. The house we had lived in for years held too many memories to ignore. A constant reminder of both our happiest days and my deepest pain. Instead of completely running away from it, I chose to make changes that felt like mine. I rearranged furniture, changed paint colors, and even cleared out the old mementos and clutter that no longer served a purpose in my life. I didn't need reminders of us in every corner. Instead, I needed reminders of me, of my resilience, my independence, and my ability to move forward. I took up journaling, something I hadn't done since college, and found it became a powerful outlet. There was something cathartic about seeing my thoughts on paper, tangible and raw. It allowed me to confront everything I had pushed aside, resentment, sadness, regret, and, slowly, new things emerged, like small seeds of hope and excitement for the life I was rebuilding. Without the usual constraints, I also found myself questioning my career in ways I hadn't before. I'd always been steady, grounded, but now, in this space of reinvention, I wondered if it was enough. With the courage that only comes after being pushed to your limits, I began exploring options I'd once dismissed, even considering going back to school. In the beginning, the idea felt distant, unrealistic, but as the days passed and I became more accustomed to making decisions for myself, it no longer felt far-fetched. It felt like the right next step. As I pieced together these fragments of a new life, a strange sense of freedom began to replace the emptiness I'd felt. For the first time, I felt the strength of being untethered, of having only my expectations to meet, my happiness to nurture. It was exhilarating and terrifying. But most of all, it was mine. Of course, the process wasn't without its setbacks. There were days when I couldn't escape the feeling of loss. Days when every step forward felt like it took me 2 steps back. I sometimes caught myself scrolling through old photos or rereading messages, wondering if there had been any clues I'd missed, any signs that might have prepared me for this. But as time passed, I realized these backward glances weren't getting me anywhere. I began to understand that while grief and healing weren't linear, there was no reason to let them paralyze me either. I reached out to new people, old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, and began to rebuild those connections. Social gatherings that had once felt obligatory now became grounding moments, reminders that there was a world beyond my pain. filled with people who cared about me and supported my journey forward. Each conversation and shared laugh served as a gentle reminder that life, with all its messiness and imperfection, was still beautiful. One of the most significant realizations came when I stopped defining my happiness by traditional milestones. I used to think that marriage, a home, and children were the markers of a successful life. But now, those symbols felt arbitrary and limiting. Happiness wasn't a ring, a shared bank account, or even a perfect job. Happiness was in the simple act of living freely and authentically, unburdened by anyone else's expectations. There were still moments, of course, when I questioned whether I'd made the right choices, wondered if there was a way I could have made things work differently. But every time those doubts crept in, I remembered the sense of betrayal, the way it had rocked me to my core, and I knew that I'd done what I had to do for myself. Forgiveness had its place, but it wasn't my job to fix what he had broken. My only responsibility was to rebuild my own life in a way that honored my worth and potential. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed something extraordinary happening. The bitterness faded, replaced by gratitude, not for him, but for the resilience I'd discovered within myself. I no longer needed validation from others, nor did I need an apology or a final resolution from him. My life had taken on a new shape, one that felt whole and satisfying, even without the promises I once held so close. Eventually, I even began to wish him well, not because I wanted to absolve him, but because I no longer needed to carry that weight. The love I had for him was real, and while it had been tainted by betrayal, it was still a part of my story. I could accept it, appreciate the good moments we'd shared, and release the rest without bitterness. He was a chapter, but not the whole story. I looked forward to the future, no longer haunted by the what ifs or could have beens. The journey hadn't been easy, and it certainly wasn't what I'd imagined for myself. But I emerged stronger, more grounded, and fiercely independent. I was ready to embrace whatever life held next, knowing that whatever it was, I would face it with a strength and self-worth that I'd fought to reclaim. It's been over a year since the dust settled, and looking back now, I hardly recognize the woman who first faced this betrayal. Time is strange that way. What once felt like an unbearable burden has softened into memories, lessons woven into the fabric of who I've become. I've learned that some endings aren't failures, they're new beginnings. Shifts that push you to confront parts of yourself you might never have known otherwise. Since then, I've made some major changes in my life. Changes that felt terrifying at first but eventually gave me a sense of purpose and fulfillment I didn't think was possible. I went back to school, something I'd only dreamed of before. The challenge of diving into new subjects and meeting people from such different walks of life turned out to be one of the most freeing experiences. I've gained a sense of direction in my career, too, one that's entirely mine, built on my passions and skills, not just a shared dream. And as I navigated these changes, I realized that I'd grown closer to myself in a way I never had before. I understood now that healing isn't about forgetting the past or erasing pain but about integrating those pieces, finding a way to hold onto what they taught me without letting them define me. I even got the courage to turn my new apartment into a space that felt like home, a reflection of who I am. Finally unafraid to take up my own space. Relationships, too, became something I learned to approach differently. I used to think that love meant sacrifice and compromise, bending over backward to ensure happiness for everyone else. But now, I understood that real love also involved standing firm in my needs, having my boundaries respected, and being seen for who I truly am. I've learned that a healthy relationship, whether with friends, family, or a future partner, respects my independence and celebrates my ambitions as much as I do. Occasionally, I hear updates about him through mutual friends, snippets about his life, his new role as a father. It stings for a moment, but only in a distant, almost nostalgic way. I don't carry bitterness anymore, only a sense of gratitude for the strength I've found, for the life I've built on my own terms. In many ways, the hardest part was learning to forgive myself for the choices I once questioned, to release the guilt for not being able to salvage something I thought was meant to last forever. Now, as I stand on the precipice of new dreams and new possibilities, I finally feel whole, Not because someone else completed me, or because I fixed every broken piece, but because I discovered a well of resilience I didn't know existed. I'm excited for what's ahead, knowing that whatever comes, I have the strength to face it with grace and courage. And for the first time, I feel deeply, unshakably at peace.